This episode of Surface Level addresses the internal reflections that we have had as the events of the Middle East have been thrust into the global zeitgeist. We do not purport to be experts on Middle Eastern relations, but humans witnessing a crisis in real time. Surface Level is not a space for hate, but one to spark meaningful conversation and foster community curious about how we see the humanity of all people. And with that, hey everybody, welcome to Surface Level, curious conversations about the Black and queer experience. I'm one of your hosts, Damon, and today, Jordan, Tony, and I are discussing the ongoing conflict in the Middle East. In the same way that we as Americans, our government does things that we don't agree with. I think there are a lot of Jewish people that would say that about the Israeli government. I would also purport that there are a lot of people living in Gaza, Palestinian people, who do not agree with the actions and the way in which Hamas is acting towards Jewish people.
Do either of you think it's a responsibility because we have a platform? Does that mean we have to talk about issues like this?
No. I think that for our specific platform, it is important to me.
Many people in our community have experienced varying levels of severity of discrimination, violence, hate crimes. And my personal opinion is that experiencing that should make you a more compassionate person.
This is Never Again for anyone. So today I would say a special reflection on events happening since October with the attack in Israel. We're about mid-November in the space and the time in which we're discussing, and we thought that this was important for us to address during the season. So we're taking, I would say, a very thoughtful approach, treating the topic with the level of seriousness that we feel that it really deserves. And with that, for the first time, we won't be playing a game today, but we're going to kind of jump right into the conversation. And I'd say the first part of this is a lot of people may be wondering why. Curious conversations about the Black and queer experience. Why did Surface Level feel that this was something that we wanted to address? Jordan, do you want to start?
Yeah, I think it's helpful to understand that when the three of us were watching the events unfold since October 7th, we were having our own private conversation around, should we have this conversation? Are we the right people to speak on this? But I think what it all came down to is that we were actually doing the work to educate ourselves on the topic. And I think that me personally, doing a lot of research and learning a lot about the history of the past, 100 years or so, I just had more questions. And I felt like I found a lot of comfort in having open dialogue with my friends who are, of all different races and cultures. And I think that this is an opportunity to perhaps allow the listeners to be able to process along with us.
Yeah.
I think that also I'm kind of disappointed with the volume of really hateful rhetoric that's happening around this conflict. And I'm hopeful that this conversation can offer the audience a perspective that's a bit more considerate and compassionate of all the people involved.
Yeah. Tony?
Yeah. When thinking about sort of political issues and this topic specifically, and as Jordan's saying, the volume around the chatter that's going on the internet, it's a lot.
Yeah.
And I started to think about, why do people stay quiet during these times?
Yeah.
And so there are many reasons, but just to give a little bit of a factoid that I found online, says that 59% of Americans stay quiet to avoid conflict in the past 12 months. And Americans who stay quiet are highest among suburban parents at 67%, folks with college degree at 66%, and millennials at 64%, which I thought was interesting compared to like a Gen Z or the boomers. And it said even though most Americans are staying quiet in political conversations, 22% misrepresent their beliefs to avoid conflict. So
that's interesting.
I think that, people which is true, and we know this to be true, and just in all facets of life, people want to avoid conflict.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And so people don't know the right or wrong thing to say, and it's kind of like when you step your foot in the mud, you're gonna get dirty, and it's kind of like there's a no-win situation. You feel like you say something, and someone's going to
Find
attack
offense.
you,
Yeah.
find something wrong with it. But I really think about like um, when we started the show
Yeah.
and being authentic around how we started this show. And it was really us sitting on the couch at Damon's talking about life, talking about things that are going on. And we've talked about many things. It's not just queer stuff. It's we happen to be Black and queer. And so that's the lens through which we look at the world. But we can talk about anything. And I think that when we don't talk about history and we don't learn about history, things have a propensity to repeat themselves.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And I think that leads to sometimes the worst parts of history happening again. We see it time and time again. It's like we've been here before.
Yeah.
And the last thing is which I think you'll hear me say many times during this conversation is it came down to humanity.
Mm-hmm.
We're humans having a human experience. And I think we can have some compassion. We can have empathy, sympathy. We can experience this together. And if we're talking about it amongst ourselves, then like Jordan said, we should bring this conversation and to our listeners in a thoughtful, compassionate way.
Well, Tony, you mentioned something that stuck out to me. Sorry, Damon.
No, you're fine.
But you mentioned that you referenced how we started the show, and that sparked my memory of season 1, episode 1, being centered around Black Lives Matter and how that was such a global narrative that was happening. And obviously we're Black, and so we're in the community when we talk about it, but that was something that I felt like for one of the few times it transcended countries and races, and I feel like everybody was talking about Black Lives Matter. And so yeah, I just remembered that, and I'm like, that's like a full circle moment, I think, in a way.
Yeah. We've done the show for a good amount of time now, and I think that the thing that we try and keep at the center of it is the authenticity of conversations that happen in our friendship. It's the reason that we typically don't do shows about people promoting a product or shows where someone just throws money at us and says like, do this thing. It's really about what's happening in our real lives, what are we living, and what is the dynamic and lens through which we discuss that. And as we were planning this season, this all kind of happened at the same time, and we were having a meeting, and what part of the conversation was that it doesn't feel authentic to go through this season and not acknowledge what's going on in the world. And further, I think that we're not the show that's, or even the people who are going to post 1 million stories and all these things, and that be our form of activism. This is the platform we've decided to create. This is how we'd like to have the conversations, and we feel like there's a level of respect and control that we can have in this space. And further, and it's to the point you were just mentioning, as a Black person, I remember during the Black Lives Matter movement, I was just like, part of the thing is not the community that it affects talking about it. It's the other individuals that, like, I don't have to be a Jewish person, I don't have to be a Palestinian person to confront and talk about topics in the world that affect anti-Semitism, that affect Islamophobia. Like, it's about people outside of said communities being a part of it, speaking up for what is right, or just trying to decipher. Like, I don't even want to use right and wrong. I think that's oversimplifying the lived experiences of people. But just, I think it's important that when you're not of said background, that you still develop a point of view, you still learn that history. And I think that that's valuable, and it's something we've encouraged each other to do a lot more of. And it's something I think we would all encourage our listeners to do more of.
Well, do either of you think it's a responsibility because we have a platform, people are listening to our show? Like, does that mean we have to talk about issues like this in this way?
I think,
Or like, because I know that that's a
yeah,
conversation in the zeitgeist too. It's like you have a platform, you need to use your voice. Like people get upset with celebrities and whatnot. Although you know that it can sometimes lead to you saying something and then you being quote unquote canceled because it was the wrong thing, or you didn't realize that you said something that offended a whole group of people. We see it all the time.
Yeah.
So
I think it's no. I think that for our specific platform, it is important to me because I think, and I'll just speak for myself, I think that our platform has to lead into the space of authenticity. It is the thing that, like, thoughtful and authentic, two specific words I would associate with what we do. And we know we've talked about this. We know that we're trying to parse through understanding it. We know that we're taking the feelings about what this means when we're in our community in Harlem, when we're in corporate communities where we overlap with individuals from both of these communities, friends we have in both of these communities. We know what it means, like when we're having conversations with our family, and we pull, I think, from all those experiences to create the universe that is surface level.
Mm-hmm.
And to ignore something for us, I would have felt quite uneasy about it. Now, if my platform is just me posting memes all day, maybe that's not where I'm looking for someone to speak. And like, I'm not gonna be the person like, stop posting your meme. I'm just like that. This everybody does it. For me, I think that it requires a level of thoughtfulness and not just shouting into the universe. And I think that we somehow misrepresent shouting into the universe as activism and as being helpful,
yeah.
when sometimes people just need to be quiet, listen, learn, and read.
Yeah, I wonder if because sometimes like we've held ourselves to a certain standard, so I think people who really enjoy listening to this show also hold us to a certain standard as it relates to many different facets of how we go about putting together episodes with thoughtfulness, with care. And so I'm like, do we shoot ourselves in the foot um, by like, is it a standard that one can't live up to all the time?
Yeah, I mean, I think that this is our platform, and I think the reality is that we are a weekly show that comes out with content all throughout the year,
Mm,
and I think for us, we do need to be thoughtful with how we curate our conversations. We know our process when we're preparing for episodes. It's not us just showing up to the studio and speaking our mind. It takes research. We want to make sure that we're being considerate. We want to make sure that we are, at least trying to identify what our blind spots might be on a topic to
yeah,
be able to talk about it. There are going to be way more people who are far more educated on this topic than us who may be able to provide a much better context as to what the conflict is
yeah.
and how we got to this point today. And so yeah, I don't think that it's our responsibility to report everything.
Mhm.
I wouldn't put that type of a pressure on our platform. But to Damon's point, it was an organic conversation that we were having between the three of us, and I think that we all decided to make a point to actually have the conversation. And I think that that's what matters the most.
Okay.
So I want to talk a bit about the conflict. So as we know, America has been a long-standing ally of Israel, and with this most recent inflection point within the conflict, we're seeing a lot more pro-Palestinian presence here in our country. I'm just curious from your own observation, why do you think that we're seeing this shift among Americans?
Mhm.
Damon, let's start with you.
I have many thoughts. One, I would say social media is a very big piece of it.
Yes.
And like, let's strip out all the like misinformation and all the craziness. But if we talk about, and we talk about history, let's talk about Bloody Sunday and the history of the civil rights movement for Black Americans.
Yeah.
The turning point for Bloody Sunday was TV. Was
Mhm.
the fact, like, if I lived in New York, the idea of racism and Jim Crow in the South was theoretical.
Yeah.
You don't see it.
Mhm.
Yeah.
You don't see what the impact of segregation is. You don't see what the impact of these things are. But when you see people crossing the bridge and you see people being beaten on TV, you see dogs being attacking people, it creates a different level of it creates
Consciousness.
consciousness. And I think that that is quite comparable right now to the concept of war, not specific even to Israel and Palestine, but just the concept of war. You think about drone strikes. You think about, oh, ex leader of said terrorist organization was taken out. But what does that mean? What are the collateral damages around it? What does it mean for people living in a war zone?
Right.
Which for us, it's just a news report that XYZ form of the armed services got this person. What did that mean to everyone else in the house? What did it mean to the neighbors? What did it mean to the entire ecosystem of people?
Yeah.
And I think that in social media, like everybody has a camera. Everybody can be reported, and there are people living in that space where you go and where you can see it, and it becomes a very visceral thing, and you understand. I want to be very careful about using the terms right and wrong, but you realize that like this is not the theoretical thing. It's real lives, it's real people, it's real humans, and that cannot be something that is just brushed aside.
Yeah.
Additionally, I think that people are having more discussion. And this isn't even just purely individuals that are like coming out saying pro Palestine, but it's about, it's interesting. I was having conversations with a Jewish friend of mine that we work together about, I think, the flattening of the Jewish experience into pro the Israeli government or anti-Semitism. And I think that in the same way that we as Americans, our government does things that we don't agree with. I think there are a lot of Jewish people that would say that about the Israeli government. I would also purport that there are a lot of people living in Gaza, Palestinian people, who do not agree with the actions and the way in which Hamas is acting towards Jewish people.
Yeah.
And I think that there are positions and organizations and governments and governing bodies of power that act in a way that the broader collection of people. I think there's something, Jordan, you mentioned, like the powerful few acting on behalf of the many, and I think that that's not necessarily reflective of all Palestinian people, to conflate them with Hamas, and I don't think it's fair to conflate all Jewish people with the actions of the Israeli government.
Agreed.
Yeah, it's just, I think that it obviously does a disservice to the actual plight of what's happening over there. I also think that there are things that America has done that would be considered by the modern definition as terrorist attacks. What we've done in Hiroshima and dropping atomic bombs and wiping out, over 100,000 people. And these weren't the military force. This was children, mothers, teachers, doctors, to your point, Damon, friends, lovers, loved ones. And it's, if you or I or Tony were in the position to make the call for any sort of military retaliation, I would think that we wouldn't do something like that to civilians. And I don't think I would know anybody in my personal life that would do that. And I think that we need to make sure that we're keeping that in mind. It's not they, and I'm hearing a lot of they.
Yeah.
Us versus them. And it's so much more nuanced than that. These are individuals, and we need to keep that in mind.
Yeah, Damon led with the first point that I was going to make, which was that social media plays a huge role in this. It gives everyone a microphone,
right,
or a megaphone for that matter,
right,
to say and just literally whatever you want. And so that is when you have like everyone in the world, or not everyone in the world, but a lot of people in the world can literally have a voice in that way. It's so amplified. And I think that's what's going on now. Like, people are getting information in ways that just didn't exist before.
Yeah.
And a lot of people didn't and still don't know the full history. Like I was learning a lot about what this complex situation. I had no idea of what was going on, when did this start, how did we get here? And I think people are consuming, which I think is a good thing, education. You know, they're getting an education on history,
Yeah.
and this is creating turmoil. It's creating people who have conflicting viewpoints about the whole situation. And I think that when it comes to a lot of people being vocal about pro-Palestine, I think people of color are drawing parallels to their own history, whatever. But I think being oppressed or just having a history of going through uh, dark times, I think people are just drawing connections in that way and having coming from an empathetic lens of like, this isn't right to them.
Yeah.
And so people are identifying and latching on in ways that just, previously
Yeah.
you weren't able to do in the same way.
Yeah.
You weren't like seeing is that does make it so much more real.
Yeah.
Like Damon saying, that whole theoretical part of it.
I also think like going back to separating Jewish people and the Israeli government, like a lot of Jewish people come from a history of
Yeah.
oppressive states, violence towards them. Like
Mhm.
even before, like modern history has been very horrible to Jewish peoples, World War II to now, but general history that is a group of people that has been grossly mistreated, and I think that even there are many Jewish people that are looking at this saying like the title of the episode never again is a reference to the Holocaust. It's something that is said in Jewish communities, never again, and then never again to anyone is something that's come out as more of an activist statement to say this happened to us, but at no point do we want to be a part of anything in remotely comparable to happening to anyone else.
Now, I have a question about that specifically, because when I heard that phrase, and then when I heard, never, what is it, never
Again.
again, and then never again for anyone, is that all lives mattering the thing?
No, it's saying like if we said that we're never going to have fucking slavery happen to people,
Mm-hmm.
and then we started enslaving other people, it would actually no. We didn't just mean no slavery for us.
Yeah.
I mean like nobody. We shouldn't. Slavery should not exist for people.
Right.
I think that's what it more
Okay.
so what it means. Not the dismissal of the Jewish experience.
Mhm.
It's saying this experience was horrible.
Yeah.
And it shouldn't happen to anyone. And more specifically, nor do we want to be a part of it happening in some way, shape, or form to anyone else.
Yeah, I think that's a good. I like that explanation. And I'm also curious to like talk to Jewish folks that I know, which
Mhm.
are a lot, mostly in like corporate America. People that I've worked with, a lot of folks are Jewish. I wonder what their take on never again for anyone, if they feel that same way
Mhm.
with that explanation you gave. So
Yeah. I think so. Before this most recent inflection point in the conflict, I don't feel like there was, at least from my perspective, a huge sort of social driven movement for justice. I think that we talked about the humanitarian crisis in Gaza before, for sure, but to the extent that we're seeing it today, I think feels new to me, and I think I would personally attribute it to three things, and it's not limited to these three things. It's just three things that are top of mind. First thing, obviously, social media. People being able to go onto their phones and get like a whole collection of thoughts, varying perspectives. And I think that social media has created a sense of urgency for people to educate themselves and to understand what is going on. And I think also it's our access to information. I think historically we've relied so much, almost completely, on receiving our information from major news networks and major publications. And um, the reality is that sometimes these organizations are filtered, sometimes they're censored, sometimes they're quite frankly sponsored or funded. And so I think that with the addition of new channels of information, digital content players that are coming into the space and being able to create their own educational content that's also equally as well sourced. I think it's helping people get a greater understanding of this topic. And then I think lastly, and you kind of talked about it, Tony, I think that the optics of what's happening right now feels very asymmetrical. And I think that watching it and seeing it on your screens, on your phone, on your TV, um, from an outsider looking in, and when I say outsider, someone who doesn't live in that area or that region, it looks as if it's a smaller group of people who are being severely impacted by this war from a larger military force. And so I think that what's happening is there's compassion for that, right? It's
Hmm.
this idea that, you know, how much is too much? And I don't think that it's just limited to citizens. There are people in the United Nations who have spoken up
Hmm.
and said that some of which of how the war has been playing out is in violation of human rights, international law.
Hmm.
And, you know, watching it, it's just, you can see it.
Yeah.
Like to
Yeah.
Well,
Damon's
that's why
point, it's not,
a lot of people who are very vocal about pro-Palestine are saying this is not a war, this is genocide because of how it's going down, and they are violating. It's what war crimes is what you're referencing. Um, so that's
yeah,
it's been
it's,
very it's been
I also, it's interesting. Like, I think that it's interesting now that we're talking, and it's also a part of being American and living in a country where you exist with a level of privilege. And I reference, like, think about, like, we as Black queer Americans, like, a few years ago, someone would have said, like, until this moment I didn't realize all this was going on, and then, like, us as a community, we're like, how the fuck did you not know all this was going on?
yeah,
And I imagine a lot of Palestinian people, a lot of Jewish people, a lot of people caught in, civilians specifically, caught in this conflict, are saying, how do you not know about these things?
mhm.
hmm
And I think that it comes from a place of you being, the world being shaken so much that, like, it breaks through people's privilege, and their ability to just, like, go to your Beyonce concert and not have to think about these things.
right. There's certainly a level of urgency that I think is coming from the fact that it's so visible
Yeah.
as opposed to receiving, you know, a written report. We're watching it happen in real time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, I'm going to sort of shift gears a little bit. And I want to talk about our peer and friend, Kevin Ortega. He hosts the show Here's Why, where he talks about current events. And he was recently criticized on his platform for being vocal about his support for Palestine. And there were individuals who called him out um, and, you know, drew the comparison of how could you support Palestine when, you know, queerness is 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 villainized and targeted in that way. What do you say to that criticism of how can you be a queer person who um,
Um,
supports?
for me, it purely comes down to humanity, and the thing that kept ringing in my head over and over was that if your humanity is conditional, is it humanity at all? And humanity for me is about people and me. No one, I think, should have to live in a war zone. No one, I think, should be without power. No one, I think, should have to live through the attacks of October 7th. No one, I think, should have to live through many of the litany of events that have happened in relation to war, to genocide, to the harm of other human beings. Um, and I don't think that, and that is factual, period, point blank, full stop. I also think that it is dismissive of the intersection of actual people in real places. Do we think that there's not a single queer person in the Gaza Strip? Do
Right.
you all the children there, and you don't think any of them are queer just because individuals may live in an environment and that they don't talk about it? Like it's cute to like talk, sit in your condo in Hell's Kitchen and say like, oh, they wouldn't like me. Just like when you've never lived an experience like that, where maybe you're there and you never get to be yourself, and then on top of that you're living in a war zone.
Right.
Um, so yeah, it's those two things. Like if your humanity is conditional, what it's not humanity. It's just the convenience of like you speaking up for the people that will do it for you. It's an exchange.
You know, also, sorry, Tony.
Yeah.
I think it goes back to the title of the episode. You know, like us as queer people, we have a unique experience around our sexuality, and many people in our community have experienced varying levels of severity of discrimination, violence, hate crimes. And my personal opinion is that experiencing that should make you a more compassionate person
Mm-hmm.
to people who also have to experience um, any sort of violence against them, whether it be on October 7th or any other date before or after that. And yeah, that just sparked in my mind. Tony, you can.
You know, I'm just like, that question makes me think about the fact that multiple things can be true.
Mm-hmm.
You can, you know, you can support or have humanity for innocent people losing their lives and what's going on, and while still in the same breath understand that in that region they may not support who I am as a person and how I show up as a queer person in this world. But it doesn't make
One doesn't cancel the other out.
like
People
Yeah.
aren't that simple. Cultures aren't that simple.
it's just that's to me like what it comes down to. People just they zoom in on one aspect and then everything else is sort of like, you know, kind of turned a blind eye to, or it's like you don't see everything else that's happening around you. You don't see the bigger picture.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I don't understand that. It's for people like that. It's like you can't have a conversation with folks that you can't talk to anyone who like
That's not
has
the
a one track
that's not
mind like
I'm
that.
like, Kevin, don't respond. I don't know people in the comments with that.
it's
Yeah.
it's such a distraction to the real issue. I have kind of like a personal story to share, which is that I've traveled to both Israel and I've traveled to the UAE, and you know I experienced racial and religious discrimination in Israel. I was stopped at nearly every checkpoint because my first and middle names are Arabic. And I was there living in my privilege, did not know what I was getting myself into, didn't realize what I was walking into. And so I literally landed and I kept asking my friends who have like, you know, more American names, if you will, George and Courtney. But I'm just like, I don't know why I keep getting separated from you guys. Every time we go through a checkpoint, like I'm being told to go into this special room where I'm looking around and it's nothing but Muslim people being held and questioned and things like that. And then, you know, I've been to the UAE where homosexuality is illegal and can have a real, you know, legal implication on, you know, sexual activity. And I was terrified to go to the underground gay club while I was there, and did not go while I was in Dubai. And even through both of those experiences, I would never consider the idea that those people didn't deserve to live because of the discrimination that I faced,
Right.
or because my identity was discriminated against. And to what the point that you're both saying, it comes down to humanity. Like, what is the cost of a life? You know, and is it for you to be able to? Is it Like, do you think that someone deserves to die because they don't agree with your sexual orientation?
Right, and it's
Um,
like this person. Oh, do you think like this civilian deserves to die because of what the government
and
there?
that's another
Right.
part. And
You
that's
know,
another part. Like, and we mentioned this earlier, the governing bodies that are establishing these laws and who are ultimately creating these top-down cultures that, fuel discrimination is not representative of every single person that lives in
right?
these territories and in these regions. And I would really hate for for someone to come to America and just automatically assume that I agree with everything that Trump has done and said in this country. It
Hmm.
couldn't be further from the truth. And so I think when I hear that argument of, how could you support that and they don't support queer? I'm like, what's they?
Who is
Because
they?
because we have to stop grouping everybody together and punishing an entire group because of the ideals of a powerful few that's indoctrinating minds, because you should believe that if the governing bodies were to actually shift, society would too,
Hmm.
especially if it shifted into a more humane direction.
Yeah.
So
Well, as we've talked about this, these issues, I'm curious to know, like we've talked about how complex the whole situation is, and not really like understanding the full history of how we got here.
Hmm.
mhm.
And so, what has been most helpful for you all in understanding the history behind what's going on with this conflict with Palestine and Israel?
So I've actually, I call it my learning journeys, which is I will find a piece of content, watch it, and then I'll write down the follow up questions that I have and then proactively search for content that explains it. And so throughout this learning journey, which I've been on since, quite frankly, October 7th, I found that the sources that I keep coming back to are Al Jazeera, which is a news network based in the Arab region. I've been looking at Vox, which has a lot of explainer videos, and they sort of take you through the history more so of the conflict all the way back into the early 1900s and sometimes even before. I'm also looking at conservative news outlets. I'm looking at Fox. I think is really important, specifically on this topic, because there is so much, um, opinions around it, that I'm making sure that I'm not just surrounding myself in an echo chamber to have my, biases confirmed.
Yeah.
I want to make sure that I am hearing what people who are pro Israel are saying and how they feel. And in a lot of instances, I can relate to some of the things that they're talking about. And I'm just like that, I can feel that. And I'm going to learn a little bit more about that. And even regardless if the news network is leaning more Israel or leaning more Palestine, I use critical thinking to help guide what do I feel about this. And I think that can only happen once you bring in a lot of different news sources. Also, New York Times podcast has been helpful. A lot more, but I think that those are kind of like bubbling to the top. And then, last but not least, having conversations like these. This is obviously with a microphone, and we're doing this, but I've had conversations with you all separately. I've had conversations with my Jewish friends separately. I've had conversations with my friends who are very, very, very like pro Palestine. It's a lot of emotion, but it's helpful to understand and to feel that raw emotion,
Hmm.
and to be able to take all those inputs and to understand how you feel about the situation.
Yeah. Um, a couple things I would say first. always trust a Ken Burns documentary. He's done some amazing work, does a ton of PBS documentaries. And one of the ones that we recently watched was called The U.S. and the Holocaust. I think that as we talk about the history of Jewish people, um, it's important to understand that the disservices towards Jewish people were not limited to Germany and Auschwitz. It's important to understand the complexity of history of the European treatment of Jewish people and the American treatment of Jewish people, particularly during that time period. And I think that it colors a lot around why there's this collective Western world support of Israel. A lot of it's guilt based on how poorly Jewish people were treated during that time period. Horrible, horrible treatment from our government and this country, particularly. And that I think is a very interesting documentary that frames, I think, for us, and this is a conversation I was having with a Jewish friend of mine. That frames us being quote visible minority. Like you immediately see I'm black. Like there's no hiding it. Like, I think a lot of times we as black people didn't understand. It's just like what I don't understand like the discrimination against Jewish people or like what that means in the societies. And I think it does a very, very great job of helping you understand discriminatory experience is quite different from ours. So I thought that was very interesting. Additionally, I would say that the Anthony Bourdain did a Parts Unknown episode based in Jerusalem, and parts of it he goes into Gaza. And I think the thing that I found most interesting about this is that it's less about the history of Palestinian people and more about the humanity of Palestinian people, showing friends, family, cooking meals, eating. I think that so much of the conversation for people that are pro-Israel lacks an understanding that these are human beings living there. There are civilians, there are families, there are friends, there are loved ones. And it's important to understand and never lose sight of the humanity of anyone. And that I thought was really important. And I thought a great glimpse and something that added, I think, in a very positive way to the global conversation happening. And then finally, this is a little maybe left field, but really interesting that like I was talking, me and my husband were talking about this, and he showed me this video, and part of it's from Dr. Maya Angelou. It's called I Am Human, and it's one of those like own masterclass things. And they ask her like, what are some of the things you've learned in your life? And she goes, I'm aware that I'm a child of God, that the it which made fleas and mountains and rivers and stars made me. What I pray for is humility to know that there is something greater than I, that I have to know that the brute, the bigot, and the batterer are all children of God. Whether they know it or not, I am supposed to treat them accordingly. It's hard and I blow it sometimes. And then she wraps up with a reference to a quote by Terrence that says, I'm a human being and nothing human can be alien to me. And I think it really summed up for me a lot of what we've discussed today. No matter what you view as wrong in someone else, they are still human and they are still just as human as you. And we do not, in my opinion, have the right to decide that any human being should have to die based on our disagreements with them. And that it's important, I think, in that last part, all that you can see that it's wrong in someone else by your point of view, you have the makings of that within yourself. And all that is right in yourself, that person has the makings of that in them as well, because we are all human and nothing about the human experience is alien to another human. And I think that if we took more time to understand that humanity exists in every human being, full stop, the less bombing and blowing shit up and killing each other we fucking do.
Yeah. I love that information is as accessible as it is present day. Like, it's available to all of us. We can all do our reading and understand things that we don't by seeking out the information. What I love about this platform that we've built with Surface Level is the ability to have these conversations amongst ourselves, and then to also have these conversations that are public facing that may encourage others to have similar conversations. I love that people who really enjoy this show hold us to a standard that we hold ourselves to and are sharing information with us. I
Mm-hmm.
get clips from people all the time about various different things. This topic in particular was one that I received many videos, so that it was almost like I didn't even have to go out of my way. The information was coming to me.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm a visual person and I love storytelling. And so, like, seeing videos that succinctly would go in depth on the history of what is happening were very helpful to me. And a lot of times it doesn't always look like a major news publication. But it's someone who's done the work that may have gotten the information from major news publications and have done their reading and then like synthesized it and culled it down to something that's digestible. I enjoy that. I also enjoy a good old-fashioned documentary. I love watching a documentary, so thank you for that, Damon. And so you all have mentioned really kind of all the ways, like talking to people who have a lived experience, talking to people who are more educated on the subject matter than I am. But my challenge is to be a better listener today than you were yesterday, because that is lacking to me. People don't choose to listen
Mm-hmm.
and not speak. And so that's my challenge for folks. More of that. I don't know if either of you have any final words before we wrap this.
You did just say something that sparked. You know, we are going to turn off the comments on this on the social clips for this episode, and um, I think it's really important for folks to take in information and sit with it and really give it some thought and figure out what it is that you truly believe, which can be difficult, especially if you are directly impacted by what's going on in the war. I can understand the emotional urgency around wanting, people to understand your point of view. But to your point, Tony, the only way that we're going to be able to get into a better place is if we all do our job of being responsible with how we're having these conversations with people and being mindful with how we're showing up in these conversations. And so that was the only thing that came to mind, was just allow yourself some time to sit with your thoughts before you. It's not the discussion isn't a race to win the argument. It shouldn't be. It should be a race to understand the other person and find understanding
Right.
with the other person.
All right. Well, that's all the time we have this week. This season of Surface Level is presented by Moby, Mobilizing Our Brothers Initiative. And if you've enjoyed this conversation, let's keep it going. Let us know your thoughts and questions at surfacelevelpodcast.com. And remember, stay curious.